It was the summer of 1974, and Jack Nicholson received a phone call that would fracture his identity in two clean halves: the man he had been up until that moment and the man he would become for the rest of his life. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to a Time magazine researcher who was working on a profile piece. The researcher had been digging through old records, cross-referencing dates, checking birth certificates, and had stumbled across something that no one in Jack's family had ever intended for him to find. The woman Jack had spent his entire life calling his sister, Ethel May, was not his sister. She was his mother. The woman he had called his mother, June, was actually his grandmother. He was 37 years old. He had already starred in Easy Rider. He had already been nominated for an Academy Award for 5 Easy Pieces. Hollywood already knew his name, already feared his instincts, already whispered about the electricity he carried into every room he entered. And he had built every single piece of that identity on a foundation that, in the space of one phone call, revealed itself to be a fiction. Jack didn't scream. He didn't collapse. He didn't call his publicist or his lawyer or his therapist. What Jack Nicholson did in the moments after he hung up that phone is something only a handful of people have ever claimed to know, and their accounts differ wildly. What is not disputed is what happened to his face after that day. That grin, the one that critics had spent years calling dangerous and charismatic and slightly unhinged, deepened into something else entirely. Something that no longer looked like performance. Something that looked like a man who had decided, consciously and permanently, that the universe was fundamentally absurd, and that the only sane response to absurdity was to grin straight back at it with every tooth showing. This is the story that Hollywood has danced around for 50 years. Not the awards, not the box office numbers, not the 3 Oscars or the 12 nominations or the legendary status that cemented itself so thoroughly that he could sit in the front row of every major ceremony wearing sunglasses indoors, and no one, not a single person in that room, full of the most powerful people in the entertainment industry, would dare to ask him to take them off. This is the story of what was underneath all of it. The architecture of a man built from secrets, survival, and a particular kind of genius that can only come from spending your entire life performing a version of yourself before you ever discover who that self actually is. Before we go any further, understand something about the world. Jack Nicholson was born into on April 22, 1937, in Neptune City, New Jersey. This was not a world that produced legends gently. This was a Depression-era working-class family where the adults made decisions that felt like survival and called them love. June Nicholson was 17 years old and unmarried when she became pregnant. In 1937, that was not a situation that the world handled with grace or compassion. It was a situation that families handled with silence and rearrangement. June's mother, Ethel May, agreed to raise the child as her own. June would be his sister. The secret would hold. And for 37 years, it did hold, perfectly, completely, with the kind of discipline that only genuine shame and genuine love, bound together so tightly they become indistinguishable, can produce. Jack grew up believing he was the son of a sign painter named John Nicholson, who had drifted out of the picture early, and a woman named Ethel May, who ran a beauty salon out of their home and kept the household together through the kind of stubborn, practical competence that working-class women of that era developed simply because there was no alternative. He never knew his biological father. He never would. That was its own separate mystery, one that Jack would acknowledge in interviews decades later with the specific kind of shrug that a man deploys when he has decided that a wound is too deep to keep prodding. The childhood was not miserable. That is important to understand, because the easy narrative would be to position everything that followed as the product of trauma, and while trauma was certainly present, it was braided together with warmth and humor, and the particular freedom that sometimes comes from being the youngest person in a household of women who find you genuinely entertaining. Jack was funny from the beginning, not performed funny, not trying to fit in funny, but constitutionally funny, wired at some deep level to find the gap between what people said and what they meant, and to inhabit that gap with enough comfort that he could make other people laugh at it too. He was also, from very early on, magnetic in a way that defied easy explanation. His high school yearbook named him Class Clown. His drama teacher recognized something that went considerably beyond clowning. When Jack moved to Los Angeles at 18, following a girl and a vague ambition and the specific recklessness of youth, he fell into acting almost by accident, finding work as a studio gopher at MGM before taking acting classes and discovering that the thing he had been doing his whole life, performing versions of himself for the approval and entertainment of the people around him, was actually a profession with rules and techniques, and, more importantly, an audience that could be measured in millions rather than dozens. The early years were rough in the way that the early years of almost every eventual legend are rough, full of Roger Corman B-movies and television bit parts and the grinding patience of a man who knows on some cellular level that he belongs somewhere specific and is simply waiting for the world to catch up with that knowledge. He wrote screenplays, he studied, he watched other actors with the focused attention of someone cataloging weaknesses and strengths, filing away everything useful and discarding everything that felt like imitation. Jack Nicholson had no interest in becoming a good actor. He had interest in becoming the only version of Jack Nicholson that could exist. Easy Rider. In 1969 was the moment the world got its first real look at what had been developing in relative obscurity for over a decade. He was not the star. He was not supposed to be the revelation. He was a supporting character, a lawyer named George Hansen who joins two motorcycle drifters for a stretch of their journey and dies without making it to Mardi Gras. In 30 minutes of screen time, Jack Nicholson announced himself so completely that the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences nominated him for Best Supporting Actor, and the entire trajectory of Hollywood casting shifted. Not because he was technically perfect, not because he hit every mark and delivered every line with textbook precision, but because he was terrifyingly, undeniably present in a way that made every other person on screen look like they were standing slightly outside of reality while Jack alone was inside it. This is the quality that would define everything that followed, the sense that whatever Jack Nicholson was doing, he was doing it from a place so far inside the truth of the character that the membrane between performance and reality had simply dissolved. Directors would spend the next 5 decades trying to understand how he did it. Most of them eventually stopped trying and simply accepted it as a given, the way you accept weather. It is there. It is overwhelming. You work around it or you surrender to it. There is no third option. 5 Easy Pieces in 1970 gave him his first lead role and his first Best Actor nomination. Carnal Knowledge in 1971. The Last Detail in 1973, another nomination. Chinatown in 1974, the year of the phone call, the year the foundation cracked, the year he played a private detective in a film about buried secrets and family corruption, and the way the sins of powerful people ripple down through generations to destroy everything they touch. It is impossible to watch Chinatown now and not feel the strange resonance of that timing. Jack Nicholson in 1974, playing a man slowly uncovering a family secret that is darker and more structurally devastating than he could have imagined, while in his real life, a journalist was uncovering a family secret that would permanently alter his understanding of who he was. Art has a way of knowing things before the artist does. Then came 1975, and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and Randall Patrick McMurphy, and the first Academy Award. If you have seen the film, you understand what McMurphy represents. He is the man who refuses to be made manageable. He is the disruptive force inside a system designed to sand down anything that doesn't fit its preferred shape. He fights not because he believes he can win, but because surrender to him is a kind of death that arrives before the actual one. He is dangerous and charismatic and deeply, genuinely caring underneath the bravado, and he gets a lobotomy for it. Jack won Best Actor. He also won something less quantifiable, but equally significant, the permanent, unspoken understanding of every major filmmaker in Hollywood that if you were making something that required a human being to stand at the exact edge of acceptable behavior and look comfortable there, Jack Nicholson was the only call that made sense. Stanley Kubrick called that edge home for the entirety of his career. He had been directing films since the 1950s and had developed a reputation as one of the most demanding, meticulous, and psychologically intense directors in the history of the medium. His shoots were notoriously long. His standards were notoriously impossible. His relationship with actors was notoriously complicated, somewhere between surgical and adversarial, designed to strip away everything comfortable and familiar until the actor had nothing left to perform from except pure exposure. When Kubrick decided to adapt Stephen King's The Shining in 1979, he chose Jack Nicholson to play Jack Torrance, the struggling writer who takes a caretaker job at an isolated mountain hotel, and gradually, or perhaps not gradually at all, loses whatever tenuous grip he had on sanity. What happened on that set became its own kind of legend, one that circulates differently depending on who is telling it and what they need the story to mean. What is certain is that Kubrick shot the film over the course of roughly a year, that he required dozens of takes of scenes that most directors would have wrapped after 3 or 4, that the production was deliberately designed to be exhausting and disorienting, to create in the cast and crew the psychological texture of the story they were telling. What is equally certain is that Jack Nicholson met this methodology not with resistance, but with something that looked, to everyone watching, uncomfortably like enthusiasm. He had grown up in chaos. He had spent his adult life performing the controlled version of it. The Shining gave him permission to let the control go, and the result was a performance so physically committed, so beyond the boundaries of conventional technique, that it functioned less like acting and more like documented dissent. The axe through the bathroom door, the face through the hole, the grin that was already, even before the moment of apparent madness, slightly too wide and slightly too knowing. Jack later said that the most effective preparation he did for the role was simply staying up too late and eating badly and denying himself the routines that a person uses to maintain the illusion of being normal. He was not, he implied, particularly interested in maintaining that illusion under the best of circumstances. Kubrick, for his part, reportedly said that Jack was the only actor he had ever worked with who had shown up to the set already understanding the character from the inside. The usual process of excavation and breakdown, the process Kubrick had deployed on every previous project to reach the vulnerable core of his performers, was simply unnecessary with Jack. He was already there, already broken open, already grinning from the place where most actors spent months trying to arrive. The Shining was released in 1980 to mixed critical reception and enormous commercial success. Time would eventually relocate it into the canon of masterpieces. But something else happened in 1980 that the story of Jack Nicholson requires acknowledgement of. His friend Roman Polanski had fled the United States in 1977, shortly before he was to be sentenced for the statutory rape of a 13-year-old girl. The assault had occurred, in part, at Jack Nicholson's home in Los Angeles, at a property on Mulholland Drive that Jack was not present at during the incident, but that he owned. The complexity of Jack's position in relation to this event, his friendship with Polanski, his ownership of the space, his silence in the years that followed, is one of the elements of his biography that does not resolve into a clean narrative. He has never spoken about it extensively. What can be said is that Jack Nicholson's Hollywood was not the sanitized, branded, crisis-managed Hollywood of the contemporary era. It was a place where enormous talent and enormous transgression coexisted in proximity that the industry's internal culture chose, repeatedly and systematically, to accommodate. Jack was part of that culture. He benefited from its protections. He has never, in any interview or public statement, suggested he found this arrangement troubling. What he has suggested, in the specific oblique way that characterizes his rare moments of apparent honesty about anything that actually matters, is that Hollywood is not a place where clarity is rewarded. It is a place where the ability to inhabit ambiguity, without being destroyed by it, is the primary survival skill. He had been practicing that skill since 1937. The 1980s gave Jack Nicholson everything. Terms of Endearment in 1983, the second Academy Award, this time for Best Supporting Actor. Prizzi's Honor in 1985, Ironweed in 1987, Batman in 1989, in which he played the Joker in a performance so baroque and so committed to its own internal logic that it set the template for how the character would be understood for the next 2 decades. His Joker was not broken. He was not traumatized. He was not the product of a world that had failed him. He was a man who had looked at the same absurd universe everyone else was looking at and had simply decided to find it hilarious. Jack had been playing a version of that character since childhood, since the beauty salon, since the women who raised him and loved him and lied to him with the specific tenderness of people who believe they are protecting you from a truth that would hurt more than the fiction. When Tim Burton cast him, he was not asking Jack Nicholson to find the Joker. He was asking the Joker to find a camera. The scene that almost no one outside the production has ever discussed in detail is the scene in which the Joker, alone in a room full of money, laughs. Not performs laughter, not demonstrates laughter for the benefit of the other characters or the audience. Laughs the way a man laughs when he is alone, and something has genuinely struck him as funny, because the idea of money and its relationship to power and meaning and human dignity has, in the context of his specific understanding of reality, become genuinely, helplessly comic. Jack did that scene in 2 takes. The second one was for coverage. The first one was the one that ended up in the film. The crew watched it and did not speak for approximately 10 seconds after Kubrick called cut. Tim Burton, not Kubrick, Tim Burton on a different set in a different decade, but the silence was of the same species. The silence of people who have just watched something that they recognize as real but cannot quite categorize as safe. The 1990s brought a few good men and the courtroom speech that became so embedded in cultural memory that it functions now almost independently of the film that contains it. You can't handle the truth. 4 words preceded by several hundred others, but those 4 are the ones that survived because Jack delivered them with the specific energy of a man who is not acting out anger, but is instead finally, after a very long time, giving voice to something he has believed about the audience, the character's audience, and the film's audience, and perhaps all audiences everywhere, for longer than he can clearly remember. The line landed because it was not a performance of conviction. It was conviction with a screenplay around it. Jack Nicholson won his 3rd Academy Award in 1998 for As Good as It Gets, in which he played a man with obsessive-compulsive disorder who is, against his clearly stated preferences and entire behavioral history, rescued from the cage of his own rituals by human connection. It was the most technically demanding role of his career in certain respects, requiring him to perform the external symptoms of a neurological condition with enough consistency and specificity that it read as genuine without tipping into caricature. It was also, in retrospect, the role that most clearly articulated the subterranean theme that runs through Jack Nicholson's entire body of work. The man who cannot stop performing, who is locked into a set of behaviors that keep the world at a manageable distance, who discovers, slowly and against his will, that the performance is costing him more than it is protecting him. Melvin Udall in As Good as It Gets steps on the cracks in the sidewalk. He eats at the same table in the same restaurant every day and requires the same waitress and cannot tolerate deviation. He is enclosed in his ritual the way Jack Nicholson had spent his life, enclosed in the ritual of being Jack Nicholson, which is to say, the way all of us spend our lives enclosed in the ritual of being whoever we decided, at some critical and usually very young age, that we needed to be in order to survive. The difference is that most of us do not have a camera recording the enclosure. Jack did. And the result is a filmography that functions, if you watch it in the right order and with the right questions, as one of the longest and most involuntary confessions in the history of popular entertainment. He retired from film in 2010, or rather he stopped accepting new projects, which in Hollywood is the same thing but said differently. He was 73 years old. He had made over 60 films. He had 3 Academy Awards and 12 nominations. He had been, by most reasonable assessments, the defining American screen actor of the second half of the 20th century. He went home to his house on Mulholland Drive and largely stopped talking to the press and began, by all accounts, to live the kind of life that famous people imagine they will live when they become famous and almost never actually manage to achieve, which is to say a quiet one, with friends and basketball games and the specific pleasures of a man who has been everywhere and done everything, and discovered that the backyard is, in the final accounting, where the most important things tend to happen. Marlon Brando was Jack's hero and his ghost and his measuring stick for the entirety of his career. The two men were friends in the complicated way that men who are competing for the same existential position, the mantle of greatest American screen actor of their respective era, can be friends, which is to say, genuinely and with real affection, and also with a constant, low-level awareness of each other's work that functioned as a kind of ongoing dialogue that neither of them was always comfortable admitting they were having. Brando told Jack, early in their acquaintance, something that Jack has quoted in various forms across multiple decades of interviews. The specific wording changes, but the idea holds, that the only truthful thing an actor can ever do on screen is to stop acting. That the moment of genuine cinema arrives when the performer has dismantled every technique, every studied gesture, every deliberate choice, and is simply there, in the frame, with nowhere left to hide. Brando had spent his career chasing that moment. Jack had spent his career catching it, and then immediately, instinctively, dressing it back up in something more dangerous and more entertaining, because nakedness alone, he understood, was not enough. You also had to make them want to look. The last time Jack was photographed publicly, he was outside his home on Mulholland Drive. He was wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses and carrying a bag of groceries. He looked like an old man who had been to the store. He also looked exactly, recognizably, unmistakably like himself, which is the rarest thing in the world, to look, at the end of a life that has been lived almost entirely in public, like the person you actually are rather than the person you have been performing for 60-plus years. Or perhaps, and this is the possibility that his whole life makes most plausible, there was never a meaningful difference between those two things for Jack Nicholson. Perhaps the performance and the person arrived together, were built together, cannot be separated in any way that leaves either one intact. Perhaps the secret that the Time magazine researcher inadvertently detonated in 1974 was not that his mother was his sister, but something more fundamental and harder to name. That identity itself is a performance, assembled from the materials available, maintained by the people around us who agree to believe it, and capable, at any moment, of being dismantled by a single phone call from someone who was not in on the arrangement. If that is the truth, then Jack Nicholson's response to it was, characteristically and magnificently, to take the information and use it, to let the crack in the foundation become the crack in the grin, the one that let the light in and also let something else out, something that audiences for 50 years sat in darkened theaters to experience and could never quite name and could never quite stop returning to. What you cannot handle, the man himself once suggested, is not the truth. It is the feeling of being looked at by someone who already knows it and has decided that the only rational response is to find the whole thing a little bit funny. That was Jack Nicholson. That was always Jack Nicholson. The boy from Neptune City who grew up in a house built on a necessary lie, who became the most dangerous man in Hollywood, not by destroying the fiction, but by understanding, earlier and more completely than anyone else, that the fiction and the reality were the same thing wearing different clothes, and that once you know that, once you really know it in the place where your body keeps its oldest memories, you can do anything. You can play any character. You can walk into any room. You can sit in the front row of the Oscars in your sunglasses while everyone applauds around you, and you can smile the smile of a man who has already seen the punchline and is simply, patiently, waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. If this story of the man behind the myth, of the secret that cracked the foundation of a legend and built something more durable in its place, of what it actually costs to be the most magnetic presence in a room full of people paid to be magnetic, moved you in any way, Then subscribe and share it with someone who thinks they already know who Jack Nicholson was, because nobody, including Jack, was entirely sure. And that uncertainty, that permanent, grinning, unresolvable uncertainty about where the performance ended and the person began, was exactly the point. Ring the notification bell. Leave your thoughts in the comments. And remember, the most dangerous thing a human being can do is to fully become whatever they are. Jack Nicholson did it. He did it in front of everyone, and none of us will ever entirely recover from watching. But to understand the full weight of that statement, you need to go back to the specific texture of his relationships with the directors who shaped him. Because Jack Nicholson was not only the product of his own instincts, he was also the product of the specific people who recognized those instincts and built conditions around them that allowed them to flourish rather than burn everything down. Bob Rafelson was the first. It was Rafelson who cast him in 5 Easy Pieces, who understood before almost anyone else that Jack's restlessness and refusal to be comfortable were not liabilities to be managed, but the entire substance of what he was offering. The scene in 5 Easy Pieces where Bobby Dupay, Jack's character, orders toast in a diner and is told that the diner does not substitute items and gradually escalates the conversation until he sweeps everything off the table and walks out, is one of the most analyzed scenes in American cinema. It is analyzed because it captures something precise and recognizable about a certain kind of American man, the man who has been given everything he needs to be satisfied and is enraged rather than grateful, who cannot explain his rage even to himself and channels it outward at whatever structure happens to be presenting itself as an obstacle at that particular moment. Jack did not play that rage. He reported it. There is a difference that is almost impossible to articulate, but immediately visible when you understand it. Acting rage means constructing the external signals of anger, the raised voice, the physical tension, the facial expression coded as fury. Reporting rage means simply allowing the body to do what bodies do when they are genuinely, specifically angry about something that they cannot name. Jack's body knew exactly what it was angry about. He had known since childhood, even without knowing what to call it. The lie at the center of his family had created a particular kind of pressure, the pressure of a system that requires everyone to maintain a fiction and depends on the cooperation of every participant to hold together. Bobby Dupay is a man who cannot maintain fictions, who sweeps them off the table along with the coffee cups because he cannot locate any alternative response. Watching 5 Easy Pieces now, knowing what 1974 would bring, knowing that Jack was carrying this specific unexploded inheritance into every performance, is like watching a man dig the hole that the phone call would eventually fall into. The great directors sensed this weight without always being able to articulate what they were sensing. Mike Nichols, who directed him in Carnal Knowledge and later Heartburn, spoke about working with Jack in terms that consistently circled around the word truth without quite landing on it. He said that Jack arrived on set already knowing more about the character than the director did, which sounds like a complaint, but was offered as something closer to awe. He said that the challenge of directing Jack Nicholson was not extracting a performance, but containing one, ensuring that what the camera captured was the portion of what Jack was doing that the film needed rather than the totality of what Jack was actually experiencing. Because the totality, Nichols suggested, was more than any single film could hold. Roman Polanski directed him in Chinatown, the 1974 film, the year of the phone call, and Polanski's methodology was the inverse of Kubrick's. Where Kubrick created exhaustion and disorientation to dissolve his actors' defenses, Polanski worked with surgical precision, building the scene from the outside in, controlling every visual element until the frame was exactly what he needed it to be, and then trusting his actors to inhabit it. With most actors, this approach produced technically correct performances. With Jack, it produced something that Polanski later described as the most frightening experience of his directorial career, not because anything went wrong, but because everything went right in a way that Polanski had not entirely planned for. The scene near the end of Chinatown, the scene that ends with the phrase that became the film's defining epitaph, involved Jack's character discovering the full depth of the corruption he had been investigating. The horror of the revelation is not that it is surprising, but that it is, in retrospect, completely inevitable. Everything pointed to this. The clues were always there. The only thing standing between Jake Gates and the truth was his own investment in not finding it. Jack played that scene once. Polanski called cut. The entire crew stood in silence for a moment. Then Polanski said, in Polish, a phrase that translates roughly to, that is the thing itself, not the representation of the thing. The thing. This is what directors meant when they talked about working with Jack Nicholson. They did not mean that he was difficult, though he could be. They did not mean that he was demanding, though he had standards. They meant that he was capable, in specific and unrepeatable moments, of allowing whatever he actually was to become exactly what the film needed, and that this coincidence of personal truth and narrative requirement was so rare and so irreproducible that the correct response was simply to record it and get out of the way. Heath Ledger called Jack before filming The Dark Knight. This is reported with varying degrees of reliability by various sources, and Jack himself has been characteristically elliptical about it in the few interviews where the subject has come up. What is consistent across accounts is that there was a conversation, that Ledger sought out the man who had previously held the Joker, and that what Jack said was either a warning or a piece of advice, or both simultaneously, depending on how you choose to understand it.